The rain outside was merciless, beating down on the city like it wanted to wash away every trace of hope. Inside a quiet little restaurant, dimly lit by warm yellow lights, a young girl sat trembling with hunger, her worn coat dripping from the storm. She held the menu like it was a burden, her eyes darting nervously over the prices, her lips tightening each time she realized that almost everything cost more than she could afford. Her name was Sarah, and that night, with only a few crumpled bills hidden in her pocket, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her fragile shoulders. Viewers, before I continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of compassion to change lives, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Hopeful Stories. Your support helps spread light in a world that often feels too dark. Sarah had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. She had been surviving on scraps from bakeries, sometimes stale bread given out just before closing. But tonight, hunger had pushed her past her pride. She slipped into the restaurant not to feel fancy or indulge, but simply because the storm outside made it impossible to stay on the streets. She had promised herself she would order the cheapest thing on the menu, eat quietly, and leave before anyone noticed her. She ran her finger down the laminated paper until she found it. Vegetable soup with bread. It was the cheapest dish listed, barely enough for anyone to call dinner, but just enough for her to stretch her money a little longer. When the waiter came, Sarah whispered her order, embarrassed by how softly her voice shook. She hoped no one in the room noticed the girl who could barely afford a meal. But someone did notice. At the next table, dressed in an elegant navy suit, sat a man in his early 40s. His presence carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that made people straighten their backs and lower their voices. His name was Daniel, and though he was one of the most successful CEOs in the city, that night he had come alone, carrying burdens that no amount of wealth could fix. He had noticed Sarah the moment she walked in. The way her clothes clung wet to her skin, the way she hesitated to even sit, as though she didn't believe she belonged. Daniel had seen hunger before. He recognized it in the way she clasped her hands together, trying to keep them from shaking. He saw it in the way her tired eyes lit up with relief when the steaming bowl of soup was placed before her. She picked up the spoon as if it were treasure, blowing on it carefully, savoring the first sip like it was the most precious gift she had ever received. And that simple act pierced through him, because years ago, he had been her. Sarah didn't know it, but the man watching her had once been a poor boy himself, sitting in the corner of a cafe, too ashamed to admit he couldn't pay for more than a cup of water. He had clawed his way up from that darkness, building a business with nothing but determination and desperation. And though his empire now stretched across countries, he had never forgotten the ache of hunger or the way kindness from strangers had kept him alive when he was invisible to the world. Sarah ate slowly, making the small bowl last as long as she could. She pretended she wasn't watching the other tables, but in her heart, she couldn't help noticing how families laughed together, how couples ordered lavish meals without even glancing at the prices. She felt her throat tighten, a mixture of envy and shame. Why was life so unfair? Why was her stomach empty while others wasted food without care? She lowered her gaze, afraid of her own thoughts. When the waiter brought her bill, Sarah's heart pounded. She counted her coins twice before sliding them into the folder. But before the waiter could take it away, Daniel raised his hand gently. "Put on my bill," he said. Sarah froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Her eyes darted up to see the man in the navy suit looking at her with a soft, reassuring smile. Not pity, but something warmer, something that made her feel human again. The waiter nodded and walked away, leaving Sarah speechless. She wanted to protest, to insist she could pay for her meager soup, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was whisper, "Why?" under her breath, though she knew he couldn't hear. Daniel didn't answer with words. He simply returned to his meal, but his mind was already racing. He knew this girl's struggle wasn't solved with one free dinner. Her story was written in her eyes, in the way she carried the invisible weight of survival. Something inside him stirred, a memory of promises he had made to himself long ago. If ever he found success, He would become the kind of person who noticed the invisible ones, the ones who sat quietly in corners hoping not to be judged. Sarah left the restaurant that night with her heart heavier and lighter all at once. She had been fed, not just with soup, but with kindness. She clutched her coat tighter as she walked into the rain again, unaware that her path and Daniel's had only just begun to cross. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's struggles only deepened. She was working part-time at a sewing shop, earning barely enough to cover her rent for the tiny room she called home. Nights were the hardest. She often went to bed hungry, the memory of that warm soup replaying in her mind. But she also replayed the moment when the stranger had quietly stepped in, paying her bill without expecting thanks. That memory gave her a strange strength. It reminded her that maybe not everyone in the world had turned cold. One morning, Sarah's sewing shop announced it would be closing. The owner could no longer afford to keep it running. Sarah was crushed. With no income, she feared she would soon lose her room too. Desperate, she wandered the city, looking for any help-wanted signs, but everywhere she went, doors closed before they even opened. Employers looked at her worn clothes and hesitant smile and decided she wasn't what they needed. It was on one of those hopeless days when Sarah sat on a park bench staring at her last few coins that Daniel walked by again. He almost didn't recognize her. Her shoulders slumped in despair. But then she looked up, and their eyes met. Recognition flickered instantly. Daniel walked over, offering the same calm smile as before. "We've met," he said gently. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but Daniel wasn't there to shame her. Instead, he sat beside her, asking a simple question that would change everything. "What do you dream of doing if life gave you the chance?" For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to answer honestly. She told him she loved designing clothes. That when she was little, she would take scraps of fabric and stitch them together into dresses for her dolls. It was the only thing that made her feel alive, like she was creating beauty from nothing. She spoke quietly, as though afraid her dreams were too small to matter. But Daniel listened intently, and when she finished, he told her something she would never forget. The world needs people who can see beauty in scraps. "That's a gift, Sarah. Don't hide it." The following week, Sarah found herself standing inside a large office building, her heart racing. Daniel had arranged an internship for her at one of his company's fashion subsidiaries. It wasn't charity, it was an opportunity. "You don't owe me gratitude," he told her. "All I ask is that you give your best." And Sarah did. She poured her heart into every stitch, every sketch. At first, she was clumsy, unsure of herself. But slowly, her creativity began to shine. Her designs, though simple, carried a raw authenticity that others couldn't ignore. Supervisors began to notice. Her work was displayed in meetings, then tested in small collections. Each time, Sarah felt as though she were stepping into a life she never thought she deserved. Months turned into a year. Sarah no longer went to bed hungry. She no longer felt invisible. Her journey was far from easy. She stumbled. She doubted herself. She cried in secret when things felt overwhelming. But she never forgot the night in the restaurant when a stranger's quiet act of kindness had set her on a new path. And Daniel? He watched from the sidelines, proud but never controlling. He didn't hand her success. He handed her a door, and she had walked through it with courage. To him, that was the true meaning of giving. Not saving someone, but giving them the strength to save themselves. By the time Sarah's first full clothing line was unveiled, she stood tall, her eyes bright with tears. The applause from the audience was thunderous, but her gaze drifted to the corner where Daniel stood, his smile steady, his nod quiet but filled with pride. She knew then that her story wasn't just hers. It was proof that kindness could ripple through lives in ways unimaginable. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, I invite you to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Hopeful Stories. Your support helps bring more true tales of resilience and kindness to light, reminding the world that compassion is never wasted. And before we end, please drop a comment below with the words "Kindness lives on" to show that you believe in the power of even the smallest good deeds. Because sometimes, All it takes is one meal, one act of generosity, one moment of being seen, to turn a life around forever.